I know this is the last day, and almost the fag end of the last day, and most of you would be tired by now, especially those who have survived the last 2.5 days. Well, what I will do is go straight, to this project, and this is a project this is an ASAP-sponsored project, and I wish I had a student instead of me standing here to do the presentation on Know Your Rights, but I'll have to do it. I'll have to do it myself. Well, the Know Your Rights India project has been somewhat inspired by another project that's going on in Israel called All Rights Project. And the challenges in the Indian case are lot much than you can very well imagine what might be called for in the Israeli case. What is this project about? It's basically about trying to put together a website, of course a collaborative website, and we will get into this. How do we bring in collaboration on this website later on? That will inform, very simply, Indian citizens on how to fulfill all their different rights, benefits, and entitlements that not only the federal government but all the state governments give from time to time to the citizens. It will be a wiki-based platform mainly, so and will provide a detail and a simple explanation on how they can be realized. So it's not as if we're just giving a list of them. We're also trying to help people realize, how to, pursue those procedures of realizing those rights, and simplified explanation of governmental norms and legal precedents wherever applicable. So all that information would be given on this website, and each one would open up further windows that, okay, here's a right to employment, for instance, and how do we go about it? Or there is a right against discrimination, and if somebody is being discriminated and someone is being spoken to, and if that person hasn't really, addressed this particular issue, then who else to go to? So all those procedures and how could be a model application, or a petition might look like, all those things would be given on the website, and will be done in a very simple language. And most of us understand that not just people in developing countries but also in developed countries understand that simplicity is something, is a quality that is completely missing from much of the legalese, which is why we fall back on lawyers all the time, on how to realize this or that. So it will be done in a language that any literate person can understand, as well as translate or communicate to another. So what we mean with the latter is that, of course, not all literate people, and barring all those cases of illiterate people, would have access to computers or to the net connectivity. So in that case, what the civil society organizations can help translate some of these things to them. There is, of course, a further, the challenge here is quite enormous in a way. We are, by a conservative estimate, we are somewhere thinking of, but we are just thinking of, right? Of generating something like 160,000 pages of web content and it will be much more than that, I know, and to be translated into 28 Indian languages, and also to have a parallel audio component to it. Technologically, we are also challenged to develop a mobile app which would also help people to get to know about some of their rights, and not necessarily, so they don't have to always have access to a computer and a net connectivity. So mobiles are something that many people are using, millions and millions of people in India are using, and mobiles in India and the cell phones in India have become a source of empowerment even for the poor, as some of you would already know. So why? Why are we talking about the know your rights? The rationale is that there is a research in OECD countries shows that benefits take up varies between 40 to 80%. It's never, it's never 100%. It's seldom even more than 90%. And what explains this low take-up? So the primary reason explaining this low take-up is the information gap that we see in many countries, and not just the developing countries. And they can be also further explained as A, people do not know what their rights are. B, people are not well acquainted with the proper procedure for realizing those same rights. A simple example would be which forms to fill up and how. Even we, with PhDs at times, scramble about which tax form to fill up and all those, and we, scramble for right. And 3, people assess the chance of realizing their rights as low and the process as painful. And this really is one of the major problems, especially in a country like India, where there would be they would be in constant awe of the bureaucracy, and they would seldom want to go, oh, forget it, 50 rupees, I might as well forget that. So they consider the process to be painful. And last point is people cannot always figure out what is the monetized value of benefits that is attached with those entitlements. So these are some of the reasons which explains the information gap, and this is what we wish to fill up through this project. Information gap in India, with even if there is a Right to Information Act in India, we think that this gap is especially wide in India, a country that exhibits a sharp contrast between a very progressive and comprehensive array of entitlements and rights and a very low degree of actual realization of these entitlements and rights, especially amongst the poorest, the most vulnerable, and the marginalized sections of its population. And currently, and we have also, we have found out through research that there is no concerted effort to address this information gap in India through utilizing the resources of collaborative online technologies, and this is what we seek to fill. There have been, many of us who may have cared to find out what's going on in India these days. There is an increasing social rights revolution going on. There is a right to information in 2005 that came in, and citizens can petition the government for a mere 10 rupees, with a mere 10 rupees attached, and find out the details of any particular policy, even what went behind the closed doors as to what were the notings of this or that officer, this or that bureaucrat, and they can find out all such details. And partly because of this, you have now in India a kind of a naming and shaming game going on, where politicians are exposed for their corruptions. So so ordinary citizens are are trying to find out information about public policies and the making of the public policies, who gets what and how. The right to employment, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, also in 2005, which is a legal guarantee for 100 days of employment in every financial year to adult members of any rural household at the minimum wage of rupees 120 per day, which is roughly US dollars 2.27, and so this has been also being practiced by many state governments, but many state governments, because they are they have different political parties than the one that rules the federal government, so they try to tinker with this kind of a right to employment, and they give it a give it a different shape, or modify the the wages, or who gets to be covered. And these are again things that the citizens do not have any idea about at times. And though in the cities people may know about some of these things, and especially if they have close relatives in the government or in the amongst politicians, but most people at times may not know about it. The exception could be Kerala, where, as Ananya Mukherjee was talking about, Kudumsri, so you have a strong civil society movement, and then the civil society organizations again inform people about the different rights. And then the right to education, which is actually, in a way, people might think it's so silly, because after almost like 60 years, we have this right to education that up to 14 years people can have free and compulsory education. But this is a really transformative right in the sense that it acts as a barrier against child labor. And then, there are ongoing campaigns about rights to food and health. The right to food is an interesting, campaign that's going on now, and it will be interesting to see how it unfolds. And there could be several provincial practices, and we would like to tap into all of these. What's the way forward? The way, as a first step, what we're trying to do is we try to launch we have already launched a pilot project which covers 4 states, Kerala in the south, just because we want to have some sense of what's going on in Kerala and why things are better in Kerala. Orissa in the east, which is largely made up of tribal population. Uttarakhand in the north, which is in the where we have a lot of right stock going on. Gujarat in the west, where Narendra Modi, the right-wing chief minister, is being lauded for his governance efforts, and we want to find out what exactly is going on there. The pilot will focus on a select spectrum of rights and entitlements, helping us to determine variations across states related to, and then we will see that how the regime, the changes or the differences of regimes explain some of those different rights and entitlements across the states, and what is that information gap in these 4 states. So is there an especially wide gap between formal entitlement and actual realization in these 4 states is one of the things that we want to study at the pilot project stage. Can this realization gap be attributed to lack of information? And this is something we would also put to test in these 4 states. How to maximize impact? And we hypothesize that the closing of the information gap would have a maximal impact on realization, that is the livelihood and human rights fulfillment of the citizens bearing them. The project objectives are, that of course we want to launch a wiki-based website, and we want to, carry forward this pilot project to the next stage of having a wider and a more comprehensive national research project aimed at identifying the information gaps concerning rights and entitlements which are most detrimental to the livelihoods of Indian citizens, and developing a methodology and assessment necessary for expanding the pilot to the national level. So the pilot would be a test one, and then it will be expanded. To identify and build relationships with partners in civil society and government that will form the knowledge community required to expand this pilot to the national level. And lastly, to establish 4 different regional nodes like northern, southern, western, and eastern, because we have states in all these 4 different regions. That will subsequently take up the task of data collection for neighboring states, and which is when we complete the national research project. We wish to measure success across 3 dimensions: content, that is, what is the usefulness of the online content as assessed by partner NGOs and a representative sample of site users, the traffic and usage, and impact. And that is and the last one we measure by the magnitude of increased take-up of benefits that can be attributed to the launching of the site. Now, this will take some time, the third one. How exactly we are going to measure success, this is going to take a little longer time. But, and this will run, parallel to that, to the national research project itself. That is when we expand beyond this pilot project. We hope to finish this work in 6 to 8 months, and the team will primarily work within India, but will draw support from the wider ASAP networks. Within India, the expertise so far has been mainly from the University of Delhi, students of University of Delhi, and other academic partner institutions. And when we talk about the other academic partner institutions, if you look at this tier, research assistants, student volunteers, and interns would be drawn from the University of Delhi, Birmingham, and Yale. This is because we have already had a very successful project going on between these 3 universities, in the past, and then we are, keeping our fingers crossed on a further lease of strength to strengthen our project commitments. And also, we are trying, and we are already in conversation with national law schools in India, where we might be able to, and there are very good indications that we might be able to, convert their legal clinics into Know Your Rights clinics. And so students would be working in some of these law schools as well. This, and of course, everybody would be regularly updated on the ASAP website. What does it have to tell us about, right, okay, just 1 minute, right? Is that okay? All right. So what does it have to tell us about, how we might, include the students in this kind of an initiative? And I think that, I look forward to more inputs and ideas and different suggestions and ways in which, the Canadian component of ASAP might connect and interact with the Indian counterpart. And I look forward, to any suggestions. And, you could send them by email, or we can have a chat after this. But I think that, right now we have many students and student interns working on this. And also back in India, there are people, because much of the web content generation will be done by the students, and they will be vetted by some of the academics, because we believe, and at least, I strongly believe, that much of the web content that will be generated by students will hopefully be in a language that is very, very simple. And so the students of ASAP anywhere, not just in India or in Canada or in US, in UK, have a great role to play in all the ASAP projects, including this one. And so students are most welcome to join us and contribute either to this or to any other project that they think is close to their heart. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Yesterday morning, I had the opportunity to attend the first panel when you were talking about the Millennium Development Goals and what might come thereafter, mostly at an international policy level. And it can be difficult, I think, to translate thinking about that international policy level into what we as individuals can do. So we might leave, for instance, feeling motivated about the magnitude of global poverty, but uncertain about what comes next. I think we started to get some ideas on the last panel when we talked about civil society. But I've kindly been invited to speak to you this afternoon by the lovely Mitu Samgupta to tell you a little bit about what I do and to give you some suggestions. And when I say you, we're talking mostly students in this case, about what you might be able to do. And so I certainly don't have all the answers, but I hope to at least start a dialogue. I apologize in advance. I haven't been able to attend all of the activities of the last few days. I've been working on a project for the International Rescue Committee and had the opportunity to present a report to them late last night, which has the chance to affect policy. So I made sure to make that a priority. But I am, even with that caveat, so thrilled to be here in this late afternoon. And I especially know that you're the hardcore, because you're here on the last panel on the Saturday in the rain. So that makes me doubly excited to be here. So a little bit about me. I worked through my PhD at the University of Toronto in political science with a focus on development studies. And since I've been doing research work which is at the intersection of conflict, peace building, and development, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. One of the things that's a big priority to me is to do on-the-ground field work and to think about how theories we have actually translate into practice on the ground. And I've had the privilege to do work in contexts like Rwanda and Liberia. I also make it a priority that my work is policy relevant, not just an academic contribution, which is something that I want to come back to in a moment. And I've also had the opportunity to work with a number of NGOs and international organizations. So in thinking about academics stand against poverty and thinking where you might be positioning yourselves as students and academics, I wanted to first talk about three things that I think are a challenge right now for international development studies and for us as students and professors alike. And of course, this isn't an exhaustive list. I think one of the first challenges we have and what we can do is to think more about interdisciplinarity. So the way that most of our university systems are set up is constructed in quite disciplinary silos. So there are certainly some interdisciplinary IDS classes, but they're mainly still driven by one discipline, like political science, for instance, or at least a family of disciplines, like the social sciences. I think one of the things that we have right now as a challenge and what we can do is think more about interdisciplinary, how we can better integrate different disciplines. When I was at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, where I've been for the past 4 years, this was very much an interdisciplinary institute. And I was with 7 other postdoctoral fellows, and 2 of them, their discipline in IDS was soil science. So this is something that I knew absolutely nothing about and wouldn't have thought of it within the realm of international development studies. And they, for instance, jotted down on their papers when I said, oh, what about political will? They thought, what a great sentence that Elizabeth King has just coined. So there are huge divides in different people doing IDS. And there is, I think, a lot more that we can do. It's a challenge for us to think about the interdisciplinarity and how we can do more to bring that together. A second challenge that I think what we can do as people situated in universities is to think more about policy relevance. And that's in an environment that's often very worried about scholarly contribution. I remember once during my PhD, I had just presented a paper that I was really thrilled with, and the comment that came back in the class was, well, great, I see the policy relevance, but what's your academic contribution? And I left feeling just so demoralized and upset, thinking that they don't care about policy. And that wasn't, of course, the intention of the person who made the comment, but there is this challenge to do both in academia. So I think one of the challenges is to think both how questions can be driven by theoretical interest. So for instance, I have a book coming out next year that looks at the role of education in conflict and in peace building. And I question this assumption in the literature that education necessarily contributes to peace building, and look at all the ways that on the ground it can also contribute to conflict. So here's this project that was driven first by a theoretical interest that has all these policy relevance. But then we can also think questions that are policy relevant, and that's where the interest comes first, and how to translate those into theoretical or social scientific questions. So for instance, the work that I'm doing with the International Rescue Committee, which I mentioned, is a review of community-driven development interventions that have been rigorously evaluated in post-conflict contexts. And they would like to take the lessons learned from these various development interventions and try to apply them to a new project that they might be conducting in Somalia. Since it has a very concrete policy impact. But I think social scientifically, we can also think about how it gets to questions that the previous panel alluded to in talking about Putnam and how social change happens. And I think I can frame those questions to also make a scholarly contribution. And that's something that we can think more about doing, I think, in the academy. The third challenge that I wanted to mention, what we can do, is think about, as people working and studying IDS, not just how to break down things. Because I feel like when we learn in classrooms, we're really great at critical thinking and at tearing down ideas. But I wonder if we can challenge ourselves to think about the next step, and that is building them back up. So I'm teaching a course right now, for instance, on peace building, and I feel like we leave every week talking about things like political institutions, economic development, justice and reconciliation, suggesting that the international community is currently not doing a good job at these things, that the neoliberal path that we've taken is not serving us well. And I think the students are going to leave with really great critical thinking skills. But I wonder, and I want to make sure we leave the class thinking, well, what's next? Once we tear this down, what's the logical implication for the international community and for us as individuals? Because we're often left very uncomfortable with where our critiques leave us. Aside from things in universities, I wanted to mention that there are, of course, lots of things that students can do to be involved in and to participate in international development today. I'm a huge believer of traveling. I taught a study abroad program in Kenya for 3 years, and both the students and I found it a wonderful learning experience. Exchanges that you can do in universities. And many of my students have actually gone on from exchanges or from study abroad programs to work with some of the organizations on the ground that we had the opportunity to meet. So of course, volunteering or working in international development is another way to get involved. And I did want to mention that at this juncture, I have lots of people coming to my office asking, wanting to become involved, and it's harder to do than you might wish. There are lots of people that want to do good in the international sphere, which is a great thing, and it's a terrible job market. And a lot of the jobs are low pay and tough work. And so I thought that might be another thing that we might want to dialogue about. But if I can offer just one piece from my personal experience there, is that we might want to sometimes consider things that are outside of our direct, narrow interest in international development studies. For instance, I worked on an internship which was funded by CETA and DFATE that looked at the landmine issue. And my window through which I entered this was through interest in security. But what I learned on the ground while doing this was that the landmine issue is very much a development issue. And so I sometimes encourage people to do things that aren't exactly what you think you want to do, but to really think about bringing this interdisciplinarity from universities also into your own work. So the last thing I want to say with about 30 seconds left is just to say that, going back to my first message, is that we are students of international development and that there's different things that we can do to continue to challenge ourselves. But no matter where we end up, always remember that we are students of international development, even when we're practicing, to always question our assumptions and our interpretations, to always remember that things look very different in the classroom or in this beautiful room in which we're having this meeting than they do in many of the places where we practice international development. And that the road to a career in international development, if that's what you want to do, isn't always easy. But I have always thought about it as very much a privilege to be able to travel that road. And I'd be happy to talk to more of you later about other ideas of things that you might want to do. Thank you.
Thank you all for sticking around to the end of this, what I think was a very exciting and interesting conference. I've had the real pleasure over the past few days to witness and be in conversation with many people whom I consider positive moral exemplars. Exemplars of academics who are also activists. Academics whose work is not merely theoretical or of a research interest, but which has a real impact on the world. And I'm very grateful for that. And I hope to continue to facilitate discussions between students and academics later in their careers to try to think about a multi-generational issue, because many of the problems that we face are indeed not going to be solved in one generation. I think many of us will agree. We want them to be, but we're going to have to work together across generations to solve them. So just one thing that I'll mention, I want to raise some very, very basic questions in my talk for conversation, but just before I do, I just want to mention that we do have, as of June, we have a global student advisory board that will be making direct input into many of the decisions that ASAP will be making and consulted by the board of directors. Additionally, some of our most active student chapters are in Birmingham, at the University of Birmingham. Luis Cabrera, who could not be here today, I should mention, is the board member who's really taken up the mantle of student involvement primarily. And so in some sense, I'd like him to be here today to also expound on some of these points. So many of the points that I'll make are coming from the perspective of someone who is still a student and thinking about how I'll pursue this career, how I'll continue to work to be not merely an academic, but an academic activist. And so additionally, we've had a lot of activity after the launch in Delhi among students, and Ashok has spoken to a project in India that we think a lot of students, both in India and in other countries, will be able to contribute to. So if you go to Academic Stand for the students and for anyone else who's interested, www.academicstand.org/students is a good a good place to go to see some of the activity of these different groups, some of the kind of commitments that people are making both on a personal and organizational level. So it's kind of interesting that we are academics stand against poverty, and well, we often focus on the role that professors and researchers are playing in solving pressing moral problems. But we're also very sensitive to the thought that students are an important part of academia, both undergraduates and graduate students. Graduate students kind of as academics in training, and also as people who are looking for fulfilling and meaningful and interesting work in general, people who have committed to a lifestyle that accepts some of the risks and fully embraces the benefits of being committed to fulfilling and meaningful work in a world in which that's not always the financially most prudent path to take. And undergrads are kind of an interesting group as well, because they are considering an even greater range of, thank you, Gila. They're considering sort of an even greater range than grad students in general of possible life paths, and have concerns about which kind of life path they can pursue consonant with prudence and their own moral consciousness, right? And I think of undergrads kind of as these inspired forces who really are looking for role models and people to show them that they can pursue their dreams, pursue the things that they want to do most, and also have a really positive impact on other people's lives. So one thing that's kind of interesting that unites students and their professors, I think, is a search for truth, and a particular kind of search for truth that I think is brought out well in a really fantastic essay that many of you know called The Responsibility of Intellectuals by Noam Chomsky. So Chomsky's responding to the skepticism of Irving Kristol, and the sentiment was expressed basically that it's puzzling that students and junior faculty, people who are in very privileged positions in a sense, especially in the context of global inequality, as we saw that really sort of damning image of our current state of inequality in economic terms. So why do these people, why do these people go left on the Vietnam War was the question at the time. And Chomsky says, I'm going to paraphrase to just update some of the terms for this discussion. But he says his response really centers on the fact that as honest people, we're attempting to find out the truth for ourselves. And I'm going to add what is going on in the world and how we ought to conduct ourselves in light of what's going on in the world, right? Moral question, besides a descriptive question about the world. So we're trying to find out the truth for ourselves, rather than ceding the responsibility for doing so to experts who are appointed by governments and governments. This is something that graduate students, many undergrads, and certainly the professors I've known in my life who have had a huge impact on me have in common as a commitment. So question one, big question one that I'd like to ask is, what role should students play at different levels in what James Orbinski, I think, very helpfully referred to as the distributive leadership I'll add, of global justice, or of the fight against global poverty in this particular case. But there are some other things that are worth mentioning, I believe. Students, besides possessing what's often referred to as youthful optimism, something that I nonetheless find in many academics far into their careers, and I think disproportionately, I think this is one of the greatest things about academia as I've observed it, is that people remain young in a really profound way. Students are also distinctively well placed to be a part of the solution to the problem of global poverty and its constituent subproblems, so I believe. For one, students have both the benefit, but also the burden, but let's talk about the benefit of embarking on new careers. This is a benefit because they haven't, in most cases, found their careers tied to a particular line of research or approach, and don't typically have the same kinds of responsibilities that come with time and professional development by default. Although I want to say that it's clear that they can take some of these responsibilities on, and in doing so, I hope develop professionally. So that's an interesting question, though. What is professional development in the context of a world in which academic activism is not always encouraged? And striking a balance is quite important for many people. Thinking about their sort of research ambitions and their activist ambitions and trying to bring these into harmony. And this is really where I think the sort of people who are already professors, people who already have strong careers in academia can really help us and can help future generations as well. So I think big question two, how might we shape our professions so that young and future academics can have a greater impact on the pressing moral problems that we face? I think this is going to involve both greater numbers of and more visible examples, making more visible the examples and positive exemplars that I mentioned earlier, academics who have really had a big practical impact on the world and continue to. And also trying to remove some of the obstacles to achieving this kind of lifestyle and this kind of work. I think we still aren't fully aware as a community, as an academic community, of the potential for cooperation and solidarity, which is possible between us, between students and faculty, and we're trying to work it out as we go along. But it would be helpful, fortunately we won't have all that much time to do so today, it would be helpful to explicitly discuss some of these matters. Great, one more minute. So a few more questions that I think I'd like to just put on the table very quickly, but are kind of sub-questions. So what would both groups, what kinds of things do students and academics who are, as I said, already professors, already established researchers, what kind of things would we like to see more of from one another? We don't talk about this. There are often various reasons of self-interest, I think, especially from students, and being shy about asking, what more would you want from me? And especially what more students would like from their professors. What kinds of challenges do students face today that they might not have had to face in the past with regard to becoming academic activists? And which challenges do we no longer face? What kinds of advances in technology and in culture and in global culture have made it easier to become an academic activist? I think, professionalism of academia might be one potential barrier, and many technological advances would be examples of advances that remove certain obstacles. In a sense, this is a plea, in asking these questions, this is a plea for academics to tell us more about your work, if you're an academic activist. To tell us more about your work and how, as a student or young academic in particular, your path developed. Whether you could have benefited from interaction with organizations like ASAP in doing so, and in what ways. Also, there's a question about, I'm almost, yes? 1 minute.
If you could wrap up, that would be great.
Okay. I didn't see the, okay. So another question is, with highly specific projects, such as the Health Impact Fund and other projects that involve a lot of technical expertise, we should start to think, I think in particular, about what the appropriate role of students is and how to bring students closer to expertise of various kinds, but also make them players in these projects and very helpful players, if possible, at this point. So, lastly, I'll just end on a kind of optimistic note and say that I think that there are certainly things that I lament about my generation and also about many of the advances in technology that have changed the way in which we interact with one another. But of the things that I'm really optimistic about and that I think are really great about the changes that have come about is that I think our generation of academics is less reliant on national cultures and on parochial kinds of identities for our notions of ourselves. And you know, given international travel, given international communication being what it is now, we're lucky enough to have the kinds of relationships with persons around the world that could give rise to a global consciousness and greater global ties, such that we can all work together to solve these pressing moral problems that we will need to solve together. Thank you.